welcome back for the reading on the way back to Mayberry. Today we read from chapter 8, and it's entitled, Above the Law. The scripture that goes with today's reading is this. It comes from 1 Peter, chapter 2, verses 13 through 16. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among people, whether to the king as the supreme authority, or to the governors, who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and do commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Over the past several years, people have asked me before, what does a 40-year-old sitcom have to do with the morals and values that we as Christians try to incorporate into our lives today? I obviously think we can learn several lessons from Mayberry, or you wouldn't be reading this right now. But there are a few episodes that really make the point, and Bailey's Bad Boy is one of them. This episode begins with a traffic accident. Someone has run a farmer's truck off the road and left the scene of the crime. When Andy and Barney catch up with the perpetrator, they find a 19-year-old named Ronald Bailey, played by Bill Bixby. Ron is the son of a powerful man in the state, and he expects to be treated with respect. Even though Andy has heard of Ron's dad, he remains unimpressed. Andy is more concerned with the fact that Ron left the scene of the accident without even a thought that someone might have been hurt. However, Ron is more concerned about being on his way and asks Andy how much it will cost for everyone to just forget the incident. Andy explains to Ron that things don't work that way in Mayberry, and Ron is taken to the courthouse. Ron is beside himself. He can't believe he is stuck in some hick town because a hick sheriff is too stupid to take a bribe. To make matters worse, it is the weekend and Ron is unable to reach his father on the phone. He resigns himself to the fact that he just might be stuck in Mayberry for a while. The next 24 hours become very important in Ron's life because Andy takes an interest in the young man. Instead of just leaving him in jail, Andy takes Ron with him on his weekend activities. Andy, Ron, and Opie go fishing, and Ron begins to have a good time until he suspects that Andy is being nice to him because Andy is really afraid of his powerful father. Andy is disappointed that he is not making progress with the boy, but he doesn't give up. The next afternoon, after Sunday's dinner, Andy and Opie are talking on the porch. Opie admits to Andy that he accidentally broke a neighbor's window while playing baseball. Opie asks Andy if he is mad, and Andy says no. Andy then asks Opie not to get mad when he tells him that he will not get an allowance until the window is paid for. Opie contemplates the consequences of his actions, and he accepts Andy's punishment. Later, Ron asks Andy why he didn't bail the little fellow out. Andy explains that if he always bails Opie out when he is young, then Opie will come to expect it when he gets older. At this point, Ron begins to see Andy's point. The next day at the courthouse, Ron's lawyer shows up. When the lawyer is unsuccessful at getting Andy to drop the whole matter, he reverts to Plan B. The lawyer brings in Fletch, the farmer Ron originally ran off the road. At the lawyer's prompting, Fletch admits that the accident was his fault, not Ron's. Andy, who is wise to the game, realizes that Fletch has been paid off and begins to let Ron out of the cell. However, instead of leaving with the lawyer, Ron states that the accident was his fault and that he wants to stay and face the consequences. The lawyer asks Ron what he should tell the boy's father. Andy suggests he should tell the father that his son broke a window and now wants to stand on his own 2 feet. This issue of personal responsibility reminds me of a specific incident in my early teenage years. When I was in the 8th grade, basketball was the sport to play. I went to a fairly small middle school that didn't have a football or baseball team. This was before soccer was the rage, so that particular sport wouldn't be coming along for a few years. We did have track, but there weren't many track meets, and it was no big deal to be on the team. If you wanted to run track, you were, by default, on the team. Basketball was a different story. The basketball team was very competitive, and we played several schools around the region. From an 8th grade boy's point of view, if you wanted to be cool, popular, and an athlete, you could reach no higher pinnacle than to be on the basketball team. The boys' basketball team at West Middle School was coached by a man named Leroy Jackson. Coach Jackson was a tall, athletic man who commanded respect just by his presence. In addition to his basketball responsibilities, Coach Jackson taught 7th grade physical science. Coach Jackson was a strict disciplinarian, but he also made his classes a lot of fun. He was a very vibrant man, always full of life and energy. It was with that life and energy that Coach Jackson handled his basketball team. From day one, he made it very clear that a certain level of behavior and responsibility was expected from each team member. The rules would be followed or consequences would result, no exceptions. In the first 2 weeks of practice, we never saw a basketball. We spent the entire 2 hours of practice running or participating in some other conditioning drill. Before the first game of the season, our team had dropped from 25 to 15 players. Looking back on it, I realized that the 2 weeks of torture were just Coach Jackson's way of weeding out the boys who weren't willing to give their all. As the season progressed, we began to see the discipline and conditioning pay off. We were a relatively small team with limited depth, and we would routinely get taunted and jeered by the opposing team before the game. However, once the game wore on, it was apparent that we were in much better physical condition. We ended up winning games we would surely have lost if it weren't for our practice and conditioning. As I mentioned, in addition to all the practice and conditioning, Coach Jackson demanded and expected a strict adherence to team rules. I remember one time when I was sent to after-school detention for being disruptive in a class. Even though the detention was only for 30 minutes, I knew I was in trouble because Coach Jackson expected us to be dressed and on the court 15 minutes after school was over. Immediately after class, I went to the library where detention was held and sat by myself in the far corner with my back to the door. I was clinging to the hope that Coach Jackson wouldn't miss me for the extra 15 minutes and that I could slip into the locker room and quickly change clothes without being noticed. At approximately 3:20, I heard a booming voice. "Mr. Fann, is that you in the corner?" Coach Jackson never called us by our first names. It was always Mr. Cole, Mr. Shaw, etc. I slowly turned around and squeaked out a "Yes, sir." "Well, Mr. Fann," he boomed, "it seems like you are late for practice." I tried to explain that it wasn't really my fault that I got in trouble, but Coach Jackson would hear none of it. He told me to change and report to him as soon as detention was over. The next 10 minutes were probably the longest of my short life to that point. At 3:30, all of us renegades in detention were released. At that point, all the other kids got to go home. My fate was much worse. I had to go see Coach Jackson. I ran to the locker room and quickly put on my practice uniform. We didn't have a uniform policy at our school, but that didn't stop Coach Jackson from requiring us to wear a very specific practice uniform, down to the kind of socks. Every day, no exceptions. After I was dressed, I walked out to the court. The other guys were already practicing. I slowly walked over to Coach Jackson and waited. He didn't yell at me or demand an explanation for my behavior. In fact, he didn't mention the detention at all. He just calmly reminded me that practice started at 3:15 sharp, and that everyone, including me, was expected to be dressed and ready to go. He then asked me if I understood. I told him yes, and that it would never happen again. He smiled, patted me on the back, and said that he was glad that we had straightened everything out. I was beginning to feel pretty good until he added that I would spend the remainder of the practice, which was a good hour and a half, running the stairs. Even for an in-shape 8th grader, an hour and a half is a long time to run the stairs. At the end of practice, I was completely exhausted, but it made an impression. I messed up and I paid the consequences. I thought about how all the other kids in detention just went home that day. They probably didn't give it another thought, and they would probably be back in detention soon. I was never sent to detention again while at West Middle School. Coach Jackson had made his point, and I remembered. In the episode, we're not given any information as to who might have been influential in Ron Bailey's life, but it was obvious that no one had taught him about personal responsibility, that is, until he met Andy. When I was growing up, I had several great role models to look up to. Both my grandfathers were good men and had strong spiritual and work ethics. My own father was a man of his word and taught me by his example the importance of personal responsibility. But others outside my family also provided the guidance and example I needed during those impressionable years. Friends, teachers, and coaches helped to instill those values that would become so important later in life. Coach Leroy Jackson was one of those people. Yes, he taught me how to be a good basketball player, but more importantly, he taught me how to be a good person. Thank you for joining me with The Way Back to Mayberry by Joey Fann. I'll see you next time.